Darling, I've said it once, I've said it again. If he's not treating you right, you just need to leave him.
I know.
I don't want to hear it again. Kelsey, have you out for payment? She's just up there. Hair care is all the rage nowadays. And what better way to take care of our hair whilst we're sleeping than with a satin-lined bonnet? If you're looking to purchase one online, they can set you back 50, 60, 70 bucks sometimes. So today, we'll be making our very own for a fraction of the cost. So, let's go. Alright, so the materials that we're going to need for this project are a piece of medium to lightweight cotton measured at 27 inches wide and 27 inches long. We'll need a piece of satin with exactly the same measurements of 27 inches wide and 27 inches long. We'll also need a piece of elastic that is the circumference of our head minus 5 centimeters. And then we'll also need some ribbon or a shoelace that is quite long for later on in the project when we're feeding our elastic through our casing. We will need a measuring tool, such as this graphing ruler here. We'll also need a pair of paper scissors, a pencil or pen, a rotary cutter or some tailor's shears, some thread snips, a steam iron, and a wool pressing mat or an ironing board, some fabric clips and some glass head dressmaking pins, measuring tape, some thread that'll complement our cotton fabric, a ballpoint needle, pattern drafting paper or paper wide enough to draft our pattern on, a sewing machine, and a fabric marking tool. Today, we'll be starting our project a little bit differently than usual by drafting our own pattern to make it easier to cut out our fabric. We're doing this because we're trying to achieve a near perfect circle with the fabric that we're cutting. And due to the fact that we are using satin, which can be a nightmare to not only mark, but cut accurately, using a paper pattern is an important factor in getting those perfect results. So, to begin, all we have to do is roll out our paper, align it with the measurements on our board, or just line it up flat if you don't have a board. Now, using a measuring tool or the markings on our board here, we're just going to mark in with our pencil 27 inches, which is right there, and then 14 inches. Beautiful. And the good thing about this pattern paper that I'm using here is you can see through it, which makes lining up our lines super easy. So it looks like that is our mark just there. So now I'm going to take my ruler and just create a rectangle. Like so, and then take my paper scissors and just cut out that rectangle so we can start marking in our pattern. Now, I'm going to be using a rotary cutter to cut out my pattern because 1, I'm left-handed, and 2, I'm a boy. So doing things neatly and perfectly is honestly not in my favor in many ways, so that's why I'm using this bad boy here. But if you're using paper scissors, that's fine as well. So now that we have our rectangle, we're just going to remove the rest of our paper, rolling it up nicely and tossing it to the side. So now what we're going to do is take our pattern paper and fold it in half lengthways. Now we want to make sure that all of our edges line up and we've got a perfectly even fold. So I'm just going to make a slight adjustment there. Beautiful. Now we're going to unfold it and use that crease line as a guideline to draw a mark down the center of our paper. Beautiful. So now that we have our line sitting in the dead center, The next thing we're going to do is put our ruler against that line again and just mark where our 12-inch marker lies. Also, we're measuring from the bottom to the top. Next, what we're going to do is just mark in 2 horizontal lines either side of our vertical line, both also measuring 12 inches. And there is our, there is our second marker. So we've got a 12-inch mark here, a 12-inch mark here, a 12-inch mark here, all coming from the bottom center point. So now that we have those 3 marks marked in, we're going to fold our paper in half again by turning it over so that our marks are on the underside, and then folding it like so. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take the bottom right-hand corner, or whichever corner is free from our fold and isn't sitting on this fold here, and fold it up, trying to create a diagonal line like so. And although this won't be a perfectly diagonal line meeting in the corner here, as we're working with uneven widthways and lengthways measurements, it won't matter in the long run, and I'm sure that we'll be able to get our perfect circle. So once we've got that crease there, what we're going to do is similar to what we did at the bottom with drawing in, it was upside down, sorry, a 12-inch line on that diagonal crease to help us kind of gauge where we need to curve out our line. Because I'm not using a stencil here, and a lot of people at home don't have perfect circle stencils, the process that I'm using today is just freehand drawing, and I'm trying to give you guys a process on how to do this as easy as possible, because no one wants to run out and buy a $50 ruler just to make a satin-lined bonnet. So, with that done, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start roughly sketching some lines in here. So I'll do a little one here, a semi-straight one about 2 centimeters long here, and then another down here, sitting at about 2 centimeters long. And that's just to make sure that we don't end up with any points at the tops or sides of our circle. So now that I've got my diagonal line drawn in here, I'm just going to slowly and carefully sketch in that line so that it meets that point there. It's always a good idea to go in with a light hand in case you need to round things out or just fix your lines. And the last thing you want to do is be sitting there trying to erase a line that you've put all the pressure in the world on when trying to draw it in. So I'll just repeat that process. Now, that is far from absolutely perfect, but as you can see, it's roughly a 1/4 of a circle. So, now that we've done that, we're going to keep our paper folded. And if you're using scissors, I would recommend adding some pins about 3 centimeters on either side out from your line, and then beginning to cut along our curved line so that we can get our full semicircle. As I'm using a rotary cutter, I'm not going to use any pins, but if you feel like you need to, feel free to. And voila, we have a semi-perfect semicircle. Now, with our pattern done, we're going to move on to pressing our fabric and folding it in half so that we can begin to pin and cut using our pattern. Let's go. So I've got my fabric laid out, my wool pressing mat underneath, and I'm just going to take my iron and give my fabric a really good iron, ensuring I get out all of those creases and it's sitting nice and flush. What we're going to do now is we're going to fold this baby in half, and then we're going to press in that folded crease line in the middle, ensuring that we maintain our raw edges on all of our sides. Looking pretty cool. So all I'm going to do is set that to the side and repeat that process but with my satin. Now it's important to remember when we're ironing satin that we want to have our temp at a much lower heat. So I'm going to turn this iron down quite substantially. Another good idea is to have a spare piece of satin just on the side to use as a test piece so that if your iron is still a little bit hot and you prematurely put it onto your fabric, you're not burning the fabric that you use for your project. There's just something about perfectly ironed satin that is just so beautiful to look at. So I'll give you guys a moment before we fold this in half and follow exactly the same process. So now that we've got our two pieces of fabric beautifully pressed and also folded in half with a crease line, what we're going to do is take our paper pattern, align that straight edge with our folded edge of our fabric, like so, and use our dressmaker's pins to pin around the outside, a few in the center and along this line here, before we cut it out. All right, so now that we've got that pinned, I'm going to take my rotary cutter and I'm going to cut out my circle. And because we're using a semicircle pattern on a fold, when we take our pattern off and unfold it, we'll have a full circle. Who else liked watching that? That was actually quite satisfying. All right, so now that we've cut that out, I'm going to quickly remove my pins. Ah! And voila. Isn't that quite gorgeous? Even just to look at. How nice. All right, enough fussing around. Let's repeat the same process to our cotton. Voila, we've got our two circles of fabric. So now we move on to the exciting part of this project, sewing it together. So what we're going to do first is just press out the lines in both of our cotton and our satin pieces from when we were cutting it and folding it. And then I'm going to lay my cotton on top of my satin like so, with both of my right sides together, which means that's my nice side, my pattern side of my cotton, and the shiny side of my satin. I'm going to do my best to align those edges absolutely perfectly. And then I'm going to take my pins or my clips and just go around the perimeter of my circle, pinning it about an inch out from the raw edge. And you may be looking at this and going, Liam, that's a bit of an overkill, isn't it? And to that I say no, because we're working with satin that is circle shaped. And if you know anything about those two things, you are going to be bombarded with unpredictable circumstances. So the more pins you have in this bad boy, the better. Now, I've got my machine set up with some thread that complements the outer color, which is our cotton. I've got it loaded with a matching bobbin, and I'm going to change my stitch settings to make my needle sit dead in the center of my foot with a stitch length of 3. All right, so with all that set, I'm going to move my project with the cotton side facing down, underneath, and align the edge of my fabric with the edge of my foot. So that should sit at about roughly a 1/4 inch for our seam allowance, which is what we want, just a very fine seam allowance. So I'm going to start with a back tack. Then I'm going to hit go. And I'm going to continue to sew around the entirety of the circle until I'm about 15 centimeters away from closing the circle in its entirety. All right, so I'm just going to stop here and show you guys something. Now you'll probably see that my fabric here doesn't line up exactly. Now that's not a massive issue because we hand drew our circle pattern, as you can see here. As we hand drew our circle pattern that helped us cut out our 2 circles, it is never going to be 100% perfect unless you are an absolute artist. And if you are, kudos to you, I'm very jealous. But as long as both pieces of fabric fall into our seam allowance, then we should be fine. So I'll keep on going and not worry about that. All right, now as you can see, we're approaching our starting point of our seam. And so I'm going to leave a gap of about 10 centimeters just there. I'm going to back tack to ensure that my seam doesn't unravel, and even forward tack again, just to ensure that that seam is locked down. So I'm going to hit my cut, lift up my presser foot and remove my project. So now what we're going to do is take out all of our pins that are located all over our fabric and turn our project right side out. All right, so I've got all my pins removed. And so now I'm going to find that little opening that we left ourselves. There it is, and I'm going to turn my project right side out. Now, the easiest way to do this is find the other side of our project, so directly on the other side, and start to feed that seam towards the hole. There we are, I can see almost. I can see my thumb there, so I'm going to take that and just gently pull my project out. Beautiful. And so now I'm going to go around all of the edges of my project, and I'm just going to roll my seam so that that stitch line sits directly on that fold. And I'm just going to place a horizontal pin going parallel to our folded edge, just to keep it in place. And so I'm going to do that around the entire circle. And although this is tedious, this is going to help our project look magnificent when we are done. Now we move on to sewing in our elastic casing. Now to prepare for this, what we have to do is take the width measurement of our elastic and then add 2 millimeters or 1/8 of an inch to that measurement, and then begin marking on our cotton side that measurement in from our folded edge. So first things first, I'll just hop that out of the road. I am going to flip this around first. I'm going to lay my elastic on the 0 of my ruler. And so it looks like it's coming in at just over 3/4 of an inch. So if I was to add 2 millimeters to this, I think it'd come just shy of 1 inch. So I'm going to round this measurement up to 1 inch, and I'm going to remove my elastic, put it over to the side, align my ruler with the folded edge of my project. Ensure that my 1 inch marker, I'm going to be using the 6, which I believe is, yes, the middle of the ruler. Ensure that it sits exactly at 1 inch. And then I'm just going to do a tiny little mark there. So we're going to repeat this all the way around the circumference of our circle, putting them as close together as we need to feel confident in being able to sew an even and consistent casing all the way around. All right, and just like that, we've got all of our marks around our circle. Now, you might be looking at this and go, Liam, this is a bit of an overkill, but it's better safe than sorry, especially when sewing a circle. And speaking of overkill, I'm now going to go around the circumference again and pin my fabric probably 2 or 3 centimeters away from our dotted line, just to secure the fabric on the inside of my circle whilst I'm sewing. During this process when we're sewing in our elastic casing, this is the time when our fabric is most likely to move around and shuffle and warp. And when that happens, we end up with unnecessary pleats, ugly warps, and we just, we're trying to create something beautiful here. So let's just do what we can to ensure it stays that way. All right. So now that we have pinned everything, marked everything, and tried to get ourselves as prepared as possible to sew the most perfect elastic casing possible, let's go ahead and do it. So I'm going to move this out of the way, drag my sewing machine back over here, grab my project, place it satin side down, and just find somewhere to start along our circle. Now, our stitch settings from before of 3 millimeters with our needle in the middle is still the go-to and is still a good way to start, but if you prefer to sew on the left or right side, you can move your needle to adjust. So I'm going to find my foot pedal and get cracking. Starting off with a back tack. So I'm just going to continue to sew along using my dots as a guide to sew in my elastic casing. With this one as well, we aren't going to leave an opening, and we're going to sew the entire 360-degree circle until we reach our starting point and back tack over the top of it to end. Now, even though we've got everything pinned here, our fabric is still going to behave like the Spice Girls and swing it, shake it, move it, make it, and have you wondering, who do you think you are? And so as we sew along, it's important just to use our hands, like I'm doing here, to just push any gathers or bunches that may occur as our fabric moves around the circle whilst being sewn. So the purpose of this is to attempt to keep the fabric as flat as possible, as we don't want any little tucks or any little warps forming in our circle. All right, so I'm reaching my starting point And I'm just going to back tack over the top of it and do one more forward tack just to make sure I'm secure. I'll hit my trim button, remove my project, move my sewing machine out of the way, and begin to remove the pins from my fabric, just like we have many times before in this process. So what we're going to do is remove all the pins except for the ones holding our little gap closed. And we're going to want to make sure that we're using glass head pins to keep that one shut, as we're just going to give the entire circle, once we've taken all of our pins out, a really nice press around that outer circumference. So, like I said just before, what we're going to do is give the entire perimeter of our bonnet a really good iron, starting with our iron here and pressing out. So we're going to do that on our cotton side actually. All right, so I've got my iron heated up and I'm just going around the edge like so, starting just in from my stitched edge and carefully maneuvering my press to encourage that pressed fold, or that iron fold, sorry, to sit directly in the middle of the edge. Now, if you're watching closely, you can probably see my marks disappearing as I go over them with my iron. And you're probably thinking to yourself, now, isn't that behavior that would get you burnt at the stake back in Salem in the 1600s, I believe? I don't know when the Salem witch trials happened. And the answer is yes. But this is not magic. This is just the magic of the friction markers that we use here at Echidna. They are phenomenal products that allow you to mark directly onto the fabric like you're using a felt pen and come off real easy, either with just some friction or a quick hit of our press. All right, so I'm just going to go over where we are yet to sew once again, ensuring that we have some idea of where our folded edge that we will hand stitch closed is going to be. All right, so now we move on to putting our elastic into our elastic casing. Now, inserting elastic into a casing like this can be an absolute nightmare, and I've learned a little hack that really helps me get my elastic in efficiently. So the first thing I'm going to do is take my thread snips and I'm just going to cut a little incision about 1/4 inch from my elastic edge, and it's just got to be a very small one. So once I've got my hole established, what I'm going to do is take some ribbon, some really, really fine ribbon like this, or a shoelace, and I'm just going to poke it through the hole that I've just created. You can use a pin or the blade of your snips to encourage this through. Be very mindful of your fingers because you don't want to be stabbing yourself. Beautiful. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to unwind this entirely. And we're not going to need this much ribbon. This is a bit of an overkill, but I just like to have it free so that I can attach it to my clip here. And rather than cutting it from the roll, I thought I'd just use the entire thing because there isn't actually that much left on it. So I'm going to tie a knot into my elastic like so. Trim off my ribbon, so there is still a little bit of a tail, but there isn't a giant one. All right, and then I'm going to find the other end of my ribbon, and I'm going to tie it through my peg, like so. Oh, I think I need a bit more of a tail to get a secure knot. Beautiful. And I'm going to send my little clip on a bit of a journey through our elastic casing. And so what I've done is I've just inserted him into the inside of it, and I'm just using my fingers to encourage him all the way along until I come out the other side of our circle here. And there we are. We've come out the other side, and let me flip this around. And as you can see here, we have our clip coming out of here, whilst the rest of our ribbon is still yet to go inside. Now, the reason I've used so much ribbon is because we can't have any gathers or any ruching happening whilst our elastic is initially being fed into our casing. Because feeding the elastic through a ruched or gathered part here, anywhere along the casing actually, can be quite difficult. So we want it sitting as flat as possible, and having as much ribbon as possible does help your fabric to sit flatter. So I've pulled my excess ribbon all the way through, and I have my elastic sitting at the opening of our casing. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to feed it through like so, and position it in a way that doesn't require any sharp turns or any warping in regards to our placement of the elastic. This will stop it twisting or turning and encourages it to stay nice and flat as it traverses the entire perimeter of our casing. So I'm gonna just encourage that with my fingers to begin with. Beautiful. And you will reach a point where it starts to bend and warp, and when that occurs, all we have to do is start to pull our ribbon. So you'll get some gathers, and then all you have to do is hold on to the ribbon end through our casing like so, and just distribute those gathers towards the end where our elastic is. So a good way to do this is to actually take a hold of our elastic and encourage those gathers to sit on top of our elastic. Now this process can be very tedious, but good things come to those who wait and those who can exercise patience. Now, before you get too far along in inserting your elastic casing, it's important to maintain a hold on the end of our elastic, because when we're sewing our elastic together to create that circle, what we'll need is both ends poking out of our casing. So, as we're feeding it through, there's a lot we've got to kind of focus on here. We've got to keep an eye on this, make sure there's no warping or any twisting within our elastic casing. And also just make sure that we constantly keep moving forward. And we are through. If you've made it this far, congratulations, you've done better than most. One thing I would like to mention is that I came up with a little hack whilst doing this project. And what I found is, if you don't want to lose track of your first tail whilst threading it through the elastic casing without having to hold on to it, when there's about 5 centimeters still poking out of the first kind of entrance that we go in, pinning it in place just using a standard pin prevents it from following through with the end that we're trying to feed through on the other side. So this frees up an entire hand, which when doing this, you pretty much want 8 hands anyway. So being able to have 2 is better than 1. So with that said, I'm going to remove this pin gently. And I'm going to take both ends in one hand, and I'm going to encourage all of my gathers to sit as far down my elastic as possible. I'm also going to untie my ribbon, and I'm going to switch out my universal needle on my machine for a ballpoint needle, as we're going to be sewing our elastic together. All right, so now that we've got our ballpoint needle in, the first thing we're going to do is check to make sure, just using our eyes and just a quick finger check, that we don't have any twists or any warps in our bonnet as a whole, because once this elastic is sewn shut, we can't unwarp it and we can't untwist it. But looking at that, it looks like we don't have any present in this one. And so we're going to take both ends and overlap them like so with an overlap measurement of about 3/4 of an inch. We want roughly about a square of overlap here so that when we join it together, we don't have any flaps on the ends and it sits nice and flush. So I can see, just by using my eye, that looks pretty square, if not a little bit rectangle, but it's square enough for me. I'm then going to maneuver my elastic underneath our presser foot, like so. And I'm just going to put my foot down to show you. And your needle should sit about 1 or 2 mils in from the raw edge of our elastic. So I can see that that looks pretty good. And rather than use my foot pedal for this, I like to use my stop-start button because it keeps all of my focus up here rather than worrying about what my foot's doing. So I'm just going to hit go, ensuring that I back tack. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew vertically down till I'm about 1 mil or 2 out of the raw edge of our elastic. Now this part can be a little bit tricky to maneuver as our elastic really wants to get up in that casing already, and the casing will start to creep forward. So you've just got to do a little bit of work to make sure that we don't sew onto our actual bonnet and our elastic doesn't warp or twist during this process. So I've pivoted 90 degrees, so we're going along the bottom edge, and we're going to repeat the process. So I'm going to go, keeping my fingernail just where that elastic ends. Beautiful. And when we're pivoting, what we'll want to do is make sure our needle is down inside of our elastic, and then we lift up our presser foot, rotate 90 degrees, ensure our fabric or elastic is sitting flat, re-lower our presser foot, and sew up this channel again. So the idea for this is we are creating a flat stitch for our casing. And the first step for that is we create, I'll just spin this around. It's a bit hard to see underneath the presser foot, but we know we've done this seam here, and this seam here, creating kind of a letter C shape. And once we've achieved that, what we're going to do is we're actually going to do a diagonal line going down to where our first seam finished before we pivoted for our second line. So I'm going to hit go. Beautiful. And then I'm going to sew a second line of stitching atop our first, going back up into that top corner. Ooh, almost missed that one. I might just go back one. There we go. And we're going to sew diagonally again, creating almost a cross or an X. So I'll hit go. Beautiful. I'm going to sew up another one of our vertical sides. Stop. And then finish our final stitch, which will be closing off our C shape. Oops, I think I might just go forward one more. Beautiful. And so now what our final stitch for this process is closing up our C shape to form a box. Beautiful. And we should end up in the corner that we started in to begin with. And to finish off, we're just going to hit a back tack and forward tack again. Hit our trim button. Beautiful. So our elastic casing or the stitching on our elastic should look like this. All right, so once that's done, all we have to do is slide our elastic in there. And before we start to distribute our gathers, you'll notice we still have this little hole here. And so what we're going to do is, before our gathers start to run around the entire perimeter, is we're actually going to fold the seam allowance that should already be set from our previous pressing. We're going to fold that over our elastic and get it to sit as flat as possible. Now this can be a very fiddly process, but once we've got it sitting nice and flat, or as flat as we can possibly get it, we're going to start inserting some vertical pins just into this little part of the casing that is yet to be sewn shut. Going through our elastic, being careful of our fingers. And we may need about 3 or 4 pins depending on how large our gap is, and also depending on how misbehaving our fabric is. All right, so now we move on to our final step of hand stitching closed our little gap. If you watched our hot cross bun video, this will be very familiar to you, and if you haven't, get ready. As somebody who doesn't like to hand sew, I'm going to show you my method of how I hand sew personally, and I've never had any issues, never had any faults. And listen, it may not be up to standard, it may not be industry standard, but hey, it's held my garments together, it's held my projects together. So let me give you a little tutorial. So I go through the eye of the needle once, like a lot of hand sewing needles tend to do with their thread. I'm just going to separate that so you can see. But I keep both ends of my tail at an even length. And rather than tying a knot here, which I usually find creates a bit of tension and a little bit of pull when I'm trying to hand sew, I actually leave it open like so. And so what I'll do is I'll find the neatest edge out of the two. So this one's looking a bit, hey, how you going? So I'll choose this one here. So I take my needle and I insert it into my seam allowance. So that's the part that goes inside of our fold. And I just pull it out, and I pull it almost all the way out, but leave a little bit of a tail, just enough to tie a very basic knot. Oops, my finger got caught there. Then tie it again. And so what we have is a double up of thread on our hand sewing needle. Let me just put that into camera. We have a double up of thread here and a knot tied here with a pretty lengthy tail there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my snips and I'm just going to trim that tail off, leaving about 1 centimetre worth of thread on there, and I'm just going to tuck that into my seam allowance fold. If we were sewing on the right side, we'd probably do our hand sewing a little bit differently, but because we are doing it to close up a seam, we can push our tail in there and we don't need to worry about how ugly it looks past that knot that we've just done. So now that I've got my thread nice and secured, I'm going to insert my needle into that fold there, come through the bottom of my satin layer, and then without separating my thread, I'm just going to try and scoot that out of the row. I'm going to go through 2 layers of my cotton. And now one thing that's really important is we do not want to catch our elastic in this hand sewing technique, because if we sew into our elastic, that can mess with the overall flow and overall look of the garment, as well as impacting the performance of the elastic. Also, when we go to put this on our head, the tension will be applied to the actual stitching that we are doing here, and it will often break. And the only thing worse than waking up on the wrong side of the bed is waking up with a broken satin bonnet that you spent hours making. Now, I never like to pull too quickly because Knowing my luck, the moment I start to get confident, I am going to cause knots, I'm going to cause thread breaks, and so I do everything with the same attention and care that I would if I was defusing a bomb. Now, if yours is looking a bit, hey, how you going, and a little bit rough, join the club. But because our bonnet is going to be so heavily gathered, you won't actually see this edge too easily unless you're really, really looking for it. And so if we have a little bit of rough hand sewing, hey, it's not the end of the world. And once we start to get a bit of a rhythm, we can start going through all 4 layers, meaning our 2 layers of cotton because we've got our fold, and our 2 layers of satin because we have a fold on that. All right, so it's hardly perfect, it's hardly even close to being magnificent, but it's closed, and that's what we want from a hand sewing stitch. So to finish it off, all I'm gonna do is take my needle here with my thread still attached and just go through the 2 layers of our cotton here. Trying to get our holes that we are forming with our needle to be as close as possible to each other. I'm then going to do exactly the same type of knot that I did to begin with. And to do that, we just do the basic kind of going through our loop, and then we are going to take our needle and go through that knot that we just formed and duplicating it. This will create a nice secure knot that is very unlikely to come undone. Beautiful. With that done, we can trim our threads. Never trim it right to the knot, but leave about 1 millimeter of thread attached. And I'm talking like about yay much, just in case it starts to unravel, because the last thing we want to do is have to re-sew that bad boy. If you're insecure about your hand sewing, just like I am, I want you to take a look at this. That is where our hand sewing is. It's so insignificant because it gets so lost in the gathers that you really shouldn't worry about it in the slightest. So let's turn this the right side out. And voila! You have your very own satin-lined bonnet. Congratulations, you just saved yourself $55 plus postage. Yes, beautiful, magnificent even. Taking care of your hair has never been so chic. Now this design that I've done today, I've done it in an oversized way so that it suits all types of hair and all lengths of hair. If you like this project or like other projects like this, please check us out on social media or on our website or YouTube. Until then, Kelsey will sort you out at the door for payment, doll. See ya.